The transport truck rumbled across the dusty roads of rural Texas, its wooden bed packed with 37 women whose eyes held the same mixture of fear, confusion, and exhaustion. They were Japanese military auxiliaries, nurses, communication specialists, medics, and clerical staff, captured during the final desperate months of Pacific warfare. Their uniforms hung loose on frames made thin by rationing and stress. Their hands trembled not from cold but from the weight of not knowing what came next. Among them sat Fumiko Tanaka, barely 23 years old, a surgical nurse from a military hospital in Manila. She had been told countless times that American soldiers were beasts. The propaganda had been relentless and specific. American men, she had learned, saw captured women not as human beings but as spoils of war. They were undisciplined, crude, driven by base desires. She had heard stories, some whispered by officers, some spread by the military press, of atrocities committed by American forces. Villages burned, women violated, the dishonor of capture made worse by the cruelty that followed. Fumiko's mother had clutched her hands before she left for duty 3 years ago. "If you are ever captured," her mother had whispered, her voice barely audible, "there are ways. There are pills. Do not let them—" She had not finished the sentence. She did not need to. Every woman in the military understood what her mother was trying to say. Now, as the truck lurched around a corner, Fumiko felt that conversation returned to her mind with terrible clarity. She looked at the faces around her, some younger, some older, all showing signs of the same dread. A woman next to her, a communication specialist named Akiko, was whispering prayers under her breath. Another woman, a medic named Yuki, sat with her eyes fixed on nothing, as though she had already left her body behind. The truck began to slow. Through the gaps in the wooden slats, Fumiko caught glimpses of a military installation emerging from the heat haze. Guard towers, barbed wire fences, American flags snapping in the Texas wind, and everywhere, soldiers. Tall men in crisp uniforms moving with the efficiency of an organized machine. Her heart began to pound so violently she thought the other women must surely hear it. The truck came to a complete stop. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a voice, American and authoritative, called out commands. The tailgate was lowered with a metallic screech. Blinding sunlight flooded in, and the heat that had seemed merely oppressive inside the truck became an almost physical force pressing down on them. "Out!" a voice commanded in English. An interpreter, a Japanese-American soldier, translated. "Carefully, form 2 lines, no rushing." The women moved like automatons, their legs stiff from hours of sitting, their minds screaming with the anticipation of what might come next. As Fumiko's feet touched the ground, she braced herself. She had read every account, heard every rumor. This was the moment when military discipline would give way to appetite. This was when the soldiers would begin to see them as something less than human, more than machinery to be used. She stepped onto the Texas soil and looked up. American soldiers stood in lines on either side of them, weapons held at their sides, faces giving away absolutely nothing. They were tall, yes, and well-fed in a way that even the healthiest Japanese officers were not. Their uniforms were perfectly maintained, their boots polished to a shine that reflected the sun. But there was no grinning, no leering, no catcalls or whistles or any of the crude behavior Fumiko had been told to expect. The soldiers stood at attention like statues, watching the prisoners move through their ranks with an expression of professional detachment that was somehow more unsettling than any display of hostility could have been. An officer stepped forward, and the interpreter repeated his words in Japanese. "Welcome to Camp Polk. You are now prisoners of war under the protection of the United States military. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Follow all orders from your guards and from camp authorities. No harm will come to you if you follow the rules." The words seemed to hang in the air, impossible to process. Fumiko's mind was caught in a loop of contradiction. This was not what she had been prepared for. Every fiber of her being was braced for violation, humiliation, cruelty, and instead, she was being told about the Geneva Convention in a respectful tone by an interpreter. Behind her, she heard Akiko stop praying. Scene 2. processing, and protocol. The intake tent smelled of canvas and disinfectant. A line of American medics stood behind tables, clipboards in hand, their expressions carefully neutral. As each woman moved forward, they were asked her name, her age, her military unit. Her answers were recorded in neat handwriting on forms that would, she later learned, become the official record of her captivity. An identification tag was issued to Fumiko, a simple metal disc on a chain bearing a number and a date. She was given a uniform, plain cotton in a tan color that matched nothing in the aesthetics of Japanese military dress. She was given sheets, a towel, a small kit containing a toothbrush, soap, and a comb. "You will have access to fresh water daily," the interpreter explained, reading from a document. "You will be provided with 3 meals per day. Medical care will be available upon request. You must keep yourself and your assigned quarters clean. Any violations of camp rules will result in disciplinary action." It sounded like a list of facts being recited by someone reading from a prepared statement. Because, Fumiko realized, that's exactly what it was. This was not a conversation. This was not an interrogation or a threat. This was procedure, protocol. The implementation of a system designed to process human beings into the category of prisoner. It was somehow more frightening than cruelty. The physical examination came next. Female medics, American women in military uniforms, conducted initial health assessments. Fumiko was taken into a partitioned area where a medic, a woman perhaps 30 years old with competent hands and a tired expression, checked her vital signs, examined her wounds, and reviewed her medical history. "You have an infected cut on your left arm," the medic said in English. The interpreter translated, "We'll clean that and bandage it properly. Have you had any vaccination for typhoid?" The medic wore gloves. She spoke through the interpreter. She did not touch Fumiko unnecessarily. When the examination was complete, she looked Fumiko in the eye, said, "You'll be fine," and gestured toward the next station. It was a moment of contact that, in its very professionalism, felt revolutionary. Scene 3. The barracks realization. The barracks were nothing like Fumiko had imagined. She had half expected a dungeon, or at least the cramped conditions she had known in military housing. Instead, she found a simple wooden building with high windows, rows of metal bunks with actual mattresses, and enough space to walk between the beds without squeezing past bodies. The women were assigned their bunks. Fumiko was given one on the second level, near a window. She climbed up and sat on the bare mattress, running her hands over the metal frame. A female interpreter, a WAC volunteer named Sergeant Helen Martinez, appeared with an armful of bedding. "You'll want to make your bunk," she said, speaking slowly so that even those with minimal English could understand. She demonstrated how to fit the sheets and fold the blanket. She showed them the posted schedules, the rules for using the latrines, the procedures for requesting medical attention. "Lights out is at 9 p.m., Sergeant Martinez continued. "Roll call is at 7 in the morning. Breakfast begins at 6. Any questions?" There were none. The women were too overwhelmed to formulate questions, even if they had dared. That first night, Fumiko lay in her bunk listening to the sounds of the camp settling into darkness. Outside, she could hear the footsteps of guards on patrol. Inside, she heard the quiet rustling of other women arranging their blankets, the occasional whisper in Japanese, someone crying softly into her pillow. She waited for something to happen. Some violation of the safety they had been promised, some cruel joke about the rules. Nothing happened. Hours passed. The guards continued their patrols. No one entered the barracks except to check that everyone was present and accounted for. No one tried the doors. No one made any attempt to cross the boundaries that had been established. When Fumiko finally fell asleep, it was not from fear wearing away into exhaustion. It was from genuine confusion about what captivity was supposed to mean. Part 2. The Discovery Scene. 4. Days of routine. Days turned into weeks, and the routine of Camp Polk became as familiar as breathing. Wake at 6, roll call at 7. Breakfast in the mess hall, served by civilian workers, not guards. Work assignments ranging from kitchen duty to laundry to maintenance of the campgrounds, lunch, afternoon roll call, supper. Evening hours in the barracks where women could write letters, read, sew, or simply sit in the unaccustomed luxury of having time to themselves. The guards maintained their distance with an almost mechanical consistency. They delivered orders through interpreters. They supervised work details from a distance. When supplies needed to be carried, they directed without touching. When a woman fell while carrying water, a guard helped her up without lingering or making conversation. The act of assistance was performed as a duty, nothing more. For women raised in a culture where power often meant the ability to humiliate, where military hierarchy had been built on the threat of casual cruelty, this professional distance was deeply disorienting. "What do you think they're waiting for?" Akiko asked one evening as they sat on their bunks speaking in low Japanese. "All these rules, all this distance. They're waiting for us to let our guard down. And then what?" Yuki interrupted. "They treat us like hospital patients, feed us regular meals, provide medical care." Her voice held a note of something between sarcasm and wonder. "Maybe they're just following rules." "No one follows rules that completely," Akiko insisted. "There's always someone who breaks. Always." But there wasn't. That was the thing that eventually became clear to every woman in the camp. The Americans, for whatever reason, were not breaking the rules. Not even once. By the third week, something had shifted in the barracks. The constant vigilance that had characterized the first days began to ease. Women no longer jumped when guards passed. They did not spend their nights braced for assault. They began to have conversations that ranged beyond immediate survival. They began to wonder about home, about what waited for them after the war, about whether the version of Americans they had been taught was, perhaps, not entirely accurate. Scene 5. The first letter. Mail call came on a Thursday afternoon. The interpreter handed out stationery and explained the policy. Each woman could write one letter every 2 weeks. Letters would be reviewed for security violations, but otherwise passed through. No personal notes to guards, no messages that revealed camp layout or security details. Everything else was permitted. Fumiko stared at the blank page for a long time before picking up the pencil. What could she possibly say that would make sense to her mother? How could she explain that she was a prisoner, yet also being treated with a courtesy she had never experienced, even in freedom? She began to write in careful hiragana. "Mother, I am alive. I am safe. They feed us. The place is clean. I do not know when I will return to you, but I wanted you to know that I am surviving." It was not the letter she had imagined writing, the one that would smuggle information about her torment or include hidden messages of defiance. It was a simple statement of fact, a contradiction of what she had been told to believe about American brutality. Other women wrote similar letters. Some added details about the food, about the medical care, about the routine. As interpreters collected the letters for censoring, there was a moment of collective fear. Would the letters be censored so heavily that they became meaningless? Would there be punishment for anything they had written? The letters were delivered to families across the Pacific, crossing an ocean and weeks of military bureaucracy, to arrive at homes where mothers and fathers and siblings were desperate for any word of their loved one's fate. When replies came, 3 weeks later, they were read with trembling hands and eyes filled with tears. "She says she received my letter," Fumiko whispered, her voice breaking. "She says thank you. She says she is grateful that I am alive." For the first time since her capture, Fumiko understood something she had not fully comprehended before. That captivity, however orderly and humane, was still separation. That the relief she felt at being treated with respect was inextricably mixed with the grief of being far from home. That surviving was not the same as living. But it was something. It was more than she had expected. Scene 6. The Garden Project. In the 5th week of captivity, the camp commandant announced a new initiative. The campgrounds would include a small garden where the women could grow vegetables to supplement the camp's food supply. The women would maintain the garden, the guards would supervise, but minimal instruction would be provided. It seemed like a small thing, a minor adjustment to camp routine. But to the women, it meant something entirely different. For the first time since capture, they would be creating something that was not mandated by military protocol. something that was, in a small way, their own. The garden plot was marked out near the eastern fence, an area perhaps 30 feet by 40 feet, with reasonable soil and access to water. Fumiko and Akiko and Yuki and a dozen other women were assigned to the project. They were given seeds, tomato plants, green beans, squash, simple vegetables that would grow in the Texas climate. On the first day, they worked in near silence, preparing the soil, planting seeds, creating rows. The guards stood at a distance, watching but not interfering. The sun beat down on them as it always did, but somehow the work felt different. It felt like they were creating rather than merely surviving. As the weeks passed and green shoots began to emerge from the soil, something shifted in the barracks. Women spoke of the garden project with an energy that went beyond mere food production. They were tending something that would grow. They were participating in a process that had a future. One afternoon, as Fumiko was watering the tomato plants, she noticed one of the guards pause in his patrol. He watched for a moment, then continued his route without comment. But in that moment of observation, Fumiko understood something. The guard was not merely supervising. He was witnessing what they were creating, and in witnessing, he was acknowledging that what they were doing mattered. Part 3. The hospital scene. 7. The injury. It happened on a humid afternoon in late July. Fumiko was working in the kitchen, preparing vegetables for the evening meal, when another woman, a medic named Keiko, was carrying a stack of hot pans from the oven. She stumbled on a raised board in the floor, and the pans clattered to the ground in a chaos of noise and pain. Keiko went down with them, her right arm taking the brunt of the impact. There was blood, quite a bit of it. And the sound Keiko made when she fell indicated that more than just the surface had been injured. Within minutes, an American medic appeared. He examined Keiko's arm with careful hands, asking questions through an interpreter, checking for broken bones, assessing the severity of the burn from the hot pans. "She needs to go to the hospital," he said. "She's got a deep laceration and burns. We can bandage it here, but she should get proper medical attention." The hospital. Fumiko had not thought about the hospital. No one in the barracks had mentioned it. The camp had a medical tent and basic facilities, but rumors whispered about the larger hospital off base where American soldiers were treated. The idea of being taken there filled Fumiko with a dread she had not felt in weeks. "I can stay here," Keiko said, her face pale with pain and fear. "It is not so bad. I can work." But the medic was already calling for a transport vehicle. Within an hour, Keiko was being loaded into a truck, her arm carefully splinted and bandaged, her expression a mixture of pain and anxiety. She was not alone. The medic who had assessed her, a man named Dr. Harrison, accompanied her. And surprisingly, an interpreter was also assigned to make the journey. That evening, when Keiko did not return, worry spread through the barracks like a contagion. What if she never came back? What if the hospital was where they truly intended to harm them? What if everything they had been shown so far was simply a long deception? Fumiko could not sleep. She lay in her bunk listening to the whispers around her, each woman adding her own fears to the collective dread. Scene 8. Keiko's return. Keiko returned the next afternoon, and her arrival silenced the entire barracks. She was bandaged properly, her arm in a white sling, pain medication evident in the slight glaze to her eyes. But more striking than her physical appearance was her expression. She looked not happy exactly. That would be too simple a word. She looked stunned, confused, as though she had been taken to another world and was struggling to reconcile what she had experienced with what she had expected. The women crowded around her as soon as the guards allowed it. Questions poured out in urgent Japanese. "What was it like? Were you hurt? Did they—" The question hung unfinished, but everyone understood what they were asking. Keiko sat down slowly, moving carefully to protect her injured arm, and began to speak. Her voice was quiet, almost dreamlike. "The hospital," she said, "is the cleanest place I have ever been." That was not what they expected to hear. Fumiko found herself leaning forward, her curiosity suddenly overwhelming her fear. "Everything is white," Keiko continued. The walls, the sheets, the uniforms of the nurses, the floors are polished so much they reflect the light. There are windows everywhere, and the air is cool. They have machines I have never seen before, machines just for taking pictures of broken bones. But what about the people? Akiko pressed. The doctors, the nurses, did they treat you well? They called me Miss Keiko, Keiko said, and her voice cracked slightly. An American doctor, a tall man with gray hair, he looked at my arm and said, "We're going to make sure you heal well. This is going to be just fine." His words were translated by the interpreter, but I understood the tone. He meant it. Fumiko felt her eyes burning. She was not sure if it was from relief or from something deeper, something more complicated than simple relief. Keiko continued her account. She had been taken to a hospital ward. She had been given a bed by a window. Nurses, American women, had changed her bandages, brought her medicine for pain, offered her water and food. A woman doctor had examined her arm, explaining each step of what she was doing, making sure Keiko understood and was comfortable. In Japan, Keiko said slowly, as if working through the realization even as she spoke, I was a military medic. I saw wounded soldiers. We did what we could with the supplies we had. Many died. The doctors were competent, but they were not. She struggled for the word. Kind is not the right word. They were professional, efficient. But this was different. Different how? Fumiko asked. There was time, Keiko said. They did not rush through my examination. The doctor explained what was wrong. The nurse asked if I was comfortable if the bandage was too tight. They gave me pain medication without me asking. When I was hungry, they brought food. When I was confused about what was happening, they explained. She paused, looking at each of the women gathered around her. I asked the nurse why they were being so careful with me. I am a Japanese prisoner. Japan is their enemy. We dropped bombs on their cities. We killed their soldiers, and they were being... Keiko's voice wavered. Careful. What did she say? Yuki asked quietly. She said that their job was to heal people, that being a prisoner didn't change that everyone deserves to be treated with respect when they are hurt or ill. The barracks fell silent. It was a simple statement, but it contradicted everything they had been taught about warfare, about enemies, about the nature of military conflict. Scene 9. The hospital visits continue. Over the next weeks, several more women found reasons to visit the hospital. Some had legitimate medical concerns that required more advanced care than the camp clinic could provide. Others suspected they might have things wrong with them, ailments that could be treated in that impossible place Keiko had described. Each woman returned with a similar story. The hospital was immaculate. The doctors were professional and competent. The nurses treated them with courtesy that felt shocking in its consistency. They were given meals on trays. They were offered coffee or tea. They were asked about their comfort and their pain levels. One woman, a communication specialist named Yuriko, developed an infection in a wound she had sustained before capture. It had been treated inadequately, and by the time she reached the hospital, it required antibiotics and careful wound management. She spent 2 days in the hospital while American doctors and nurses worked to save her arm. When she returned to the barracks, she was emotional in a way that none of them had been prepared to witness. They saved my arm, Yuriko said over and over. In Japan, they would have amputated it. I would have been useless. But here they gave me medicine that cost money, that used resources, for a Japanese prisoner, a woman who is their enemy. Why? Fumiko asked. Why would they do that? Yuriko shook her head slowly. I asked. The doctor told me that prisoners deserve medical care, that it was part of the Geneva Convention, but it was more than that. I could see it in their faces. They genuinely wanted me to be well. Scene 10. Fumiko's turn. It was inevitable that Fumiko herself would eventually need hospital care. The infection in her arm, the one that had been treated at intake, had initially improved but had never fully healed. In August, she developed a fever, and Dr. Harrison, who regularly visited the camp for inspections, immediately recommended that she be transferred to the hospital for proper treatment. Fumiko found herself on the same transport truck that had carried Keiko. riding down roads that took her away from the familiar confines of Camp Polk and toward the larger American military installation where the hospital was located. She was terrified in a way that surprised her. The camp had become, in some strange way, familiar. She knew its routines. She understood its rhythms. The hospital was unknown. And despite everything that Keiko and Yuriko and the others had told her, there was still a part of her that feared that this was where the veneer of civilization would drop away. The hospital appeared through the truck window like something from an American film. It was a large brick building, newer than most of the camp structures, with wide windows and a columned entrance. American flags flew from poles. Ambulances and military vehicles were parked in neat rows. A nurse met her at the entrance. An American woman, perhaps 40 years old, with kind eyes and an air of complete professional competence. "Welcome," the nurse said through an interpreter. "You're Fumiko, correct? I'm Nurse Margaret. We're going to get you feeling better." The intake process for the hospital was thorough and once again entirely professional. Fumiko was taken to a room, an actual room, not a bed in a ward, where she was asked to change into a hospital gown. A doctor came to examine her, listened to her chest with a stethoscope, looked at her arm, asked questions about her symptoms. The fever was from an infection that had gone undetected. It required antibiotics and careful monitoring. She would need to stay in the hospital for at least 3 days. She was given a bed by a window. Clean sheets. A blanket that felt like it was made from actual cotton, not the rougher material of camp bedding. A nightstand with a lamp. A chair. The other patients in the ward were all American soldiers, men with various injuries and illnesses. When they saw Fumiko, there was a moment of surprise, but then they simply nodded at her and went back to their own recovery. A nurse came in with a tray of food. Soup that actually tasted like it was made from broth, not water. Bread that was soft and fresh. Fruit, an apple, something Fumiko had not tasted in months. "Eat as much as you can," the nurse said. "Your body needs fuel to fight the infection." Over the next 3 days, Fumiko experienced something that could not be easily categorized. She was ill, certainly. Her fever was high enough that she spent hours in a state of semi-consciousness. But even in that fever state, she was aware of being cared for in a way that she had never experienced before. Nurses checked on her hourly. They brought her cool water to drink. They changed her bedding when she sweated through it. When she was anxious or confused, they spoke to her gently and explained what was happening. When she was in pain, they gave her medicine. When she needed to use the toilet, they helped her, maintaining her dignity even in that vulnerability. Dr. Harrison visited her on the second day. He examined her arm, looked at her chart, and said, "The infection is responding to treatment. You're going to be fine. In a few days, you'll be back to normal." It was said with such certainty, such confidence, that Fumiko found herself believing him. Scene 11. The breaking point. On the 3rd morning in the hospital, Fumiko woke to find that her fever had broken. She felt weak, but clear-headed for the first time in days. Sunlight was streaming through the window. The hospital was quiet, the normal morning routines not yet in full swing. A nurse came in, a younger woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, with blonde hair and a direct manner, to check Fumiko's vital signs. "Your temperature's normal," the nurse said, checking the thermometer. "That's wonderful news. How are you feeling?" "Better," Fumiko replied in halting English. "Much better." The nurse smiled. "I'm glad. Dr. Harrison will probably discharge you today. You'll go back to your camp and you should be able to return to light duties within a week or so." Fumiko nodded. She should have been relieved. Instead, she felt something breaking open inside her. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of maintaining fear for so long. Perhaps it was the contradiction between everything she had been taught and everything she was experiencing. Perhaps it was simply that she had run out of emotional resources to keep processing the impossible. As the nurse was leaving the room, Fumiko heard her own voice, speaking in English words she had learned from listening to guards and interpreters, her accent thick but her meaning clear. "Are you angels?" The nurse stopped and turned back. She looked at Fumiko, and her expression, one of surprise and sudden understanding, made it clear that she comprehended what Fumiko was really asking. "No, honey," the nurse said softly. She sat down on the edge of Fumiko's bed. We're not angels. We're just people. People who believe that everyone deserves to be taken care of when they're sick, no matter where they come from or what country they're from, or whether we're at war with them. It was such a simple statement. But to Fumiko, who had been raised in a world where mercy was a luxury, where kindness was a weapon to be used strategically, where the hierarchy of military life meant that your value as a human being was determined by your rank and your usefulness, it was revolutionary. She looked at the nurse, at her clean uniform, her clear eyes, her hands that had bandaged wounds and adjusted pillows and brought water without any expectation of reward or recognition, and something inside Fumiko gave way. She began to cry. The nurse simply sat there, not offering platitudes, not trying to explain or justify or make it better. Just sitting with her while she processed the reality that her understanding of the world had been, in many fundamental ways, wrong. Part 4. The Transformation Scene. 12. Return to Camp. When Fumiko returned to Camp Polk, she was different. Not physically, though the infection had cleared and her arm was healing well. But internally, something had shifted. She returned to the barracks with an authority that came not from any official designation, but from experience. She had been to the hospital. She had been treated with dignity and competence by the people she had been taught to fear. She had experienced a level of medical care that went beyond mere survival into something approaching the philosophy of healing as a human right rather than a military commodity. The other women gathered around her as they had gathered around Keiko and Yuriko. But Fumiko's account was different. She did not describe the hospital with wonder, though there was wonder in it. She described it as a revelation. They have machines that see inside your body without cutting, she said. They have medicines that stop infections. They have time, actual time, to spend caring for each patient. And it is not because they are rich or powerful or deserve it. It is because they believe that being sick is enough of a reason to deserve care. That's madness, Akiko said, but her voice had lost its cynicism. No military can operate that way. Apparently this one does, Fumiko replied. I think this might be why they are winning the war. The statement hung in the air. It was dangerous in a way. It contradicted the propaganda they had all absorbed, but more and more women were arriving at the same conclusion. The Americans' strength was not just in their weapons or their numbers. It was in their systems. It was in their belief that humans had inherent dignity that could not be stripped away, even in war. Scene 13. The ripple effect. Over the following weeks, more women found themselves needing hospital care. Some had genuine medical issues. Others perhaps exaggerated symptoms or visited the camp clinic with complaints that might not have risen to the level of concern in other circumstances. But the camp doctors and interpreters seemed to understand what was happening. Each time a woman returned from the hospital, she returned transformed in some way. Not traumatized, not broken by what she had witnessed. Changed by the recognition that mercy existed on a scale she had not thought possible. The camp itself began to shift in response to these stories. Women spoke more openly about their treatment, about the apparent contradiction between the enemy they had been taught to expect and the military personnel they actually encountered. Some women began to improve their English, learning words and phrases not just to follow orders, but to communicate more directly with the Americans around them. The guards, for their part, began to notice the change. The tension that had characterized the early weeks of captivity was replaced by something more complex, a kind of quiet coexistence where both sides understood the rules and, increasingly, understood that the rules were designed to protect rather than to oppress. One afternoon, as Fumiko was helping to tend the garden, a guard, a young man from Iowa named Private Samuel Chen, paused in his patrol to watch the work. In previous weeks, he would have moved on after a moment. This time he lingered. "The plants look good," he said to the interpreter, who happened to be standing nearby. The interpreter translated into Japanese. Fumiko looked up from the tomato plants she was watering. "Thank you," she said in careful English. "We are trying to make something grow in a place made for war." The guard seemed to consider this. Then he nodded, and a very slight smile crossed his face before he continued his patrol. It was a moment of human connection, brief and constrained by the rules that governed the camp, but real, nonetheless. Scene 14. Letters home. By the second month of captivity, the mail program had expanded. Women were allowed to write every 10 days instead of every 2 weeks. Letters began to flow from the camp across the Pacific to Japanese families who were desperate for news of their loved ones. The letters that women wrote had evolved. The early messages of bare survival, "I am alive," had been replaced by more detailed accounts. Not propaganda or political statements, but simple descriptions of their days. The food they were eating, the work they were doing, the weather in Texas, the fact that they were receiving medical care. Censors read every letter, but they appeared to be censoring only for security violations, not for any other reason. If Fumiko wanted to write that an American nurse had treated her infection with antibiotics, that was allowed. If Keiko wanted to describe the hospital in detail, that was permitted. If Yuriko wanted to tell her family that she still had her arm, that she had American doctors to thank for it, that was not struck out. Fumiko wrote to her mother, "I have seen things that contradict everything I was taught. I have been hurt, yes, but not by cruelty. I have been healed by people I was told were my enemy. I am a prisoner, but I do not live in the darkness I expected. I do not know what this means for Japan or for the war or for my future, but I know that the world is more complicated than I was taught, and that mercy exists even in the places where we least expect to find it." The letter was censored, but it passed through. It reached her mother 3 weeks later, and that letter would change the shape of how that family understood the war, and America, and the meaning of being human.
Scene 15. Months pass. By November, as the Texas autumn began to cool the camp, Fumiko had become something of an unofficial liaison between the prisoners and the American medical personnel. She had learned enough English to communicate beyond simple phrases. She understood the hospital routines. She could explain to other women what to expect, what to bring, how to ask for what they needed.
The women who came to her with concerns were no longer afraid to go to the hospital. They understood that it was a place of healing, not a trap. And they went willingly, knowing that they would be treated with competence and care. One afternoon, a young woman named Tomo, barely 20 years old, came to Fumiko in tears. She had been having severe headaches for weeks, and she was terrified that there was something seriously wrong with her, that she was going to die, and that no one would ever know or care. Fumiko took her to the camp medical clinic and explained the symptoms to the doctor. Within an hour, arrangements had been made for Tomo to visit the hospital for a thorough examination. She returned the next day with a diagnosis and a prescription. It was tension headaches, the doctor had explained through an interpreter. Stress and the uncertainty of her situation were manifesting as physical pain. She was given medicine and instructions for rest and relaxation. The doctor had also provided her with a written note, translated into Japanese, explaining what had been found and how to manage her symptoms. "No one is going to die," the note read. "You're going to be fine. Your health is important. Please take care of yourself." Tomoe clutched the note as though it were a treasure. That night, she read it aloud to the other women, her voice breaking. "They care enough to explain," she said. "Even for me. Even for someone they don't know. Even for an enemy, they care enough to explain." Scene 16. The Recognition. By December, the war in the Pacific was clearly drawing toward its conclusion. News filtered into the camp through censored reports and through the interpreters and guards who sometimes inadvertently revealed information. The situation was not good for Japan. The American forces were advancing on multiple fronts. The end, when it came, would likely come soon. In the barracks, women began to contemplate what that might mean. What happened to prisoners after the war ended? Would they be released? Would they face trials? Would they be allowed to go home? The uncertainty created a strange kind of anxiety. But it was not the same anxiety that had characterized their early days in captivity. That had been the fear of the unknown, the fear of violation and cruelty. This was something different. This was the fear of losing something that, against all logic and all her previous conditioning, Fumiko had come to value. She had come to value the order of the camp, the predictability of the routines, the knowledge that she would be fed and cared for and treated with respect. She had come to value the American doctors and nurses who had proven through their actions that mercy was not weakness, but strength. She had come to value the American soldiers who maintained the rules not because they were cruel, but because they were professional and understood that protecting boundaries also meant protecting dignity. One afternoon, as she was writing a letter to her mother, she tried to explain this impossible feeling. I am a prisoner, but I am also safe. I am far from home, but I am cared for. I am enemy to people who treat me with kindness. I do not know how to reconcile these things, but I know that when this war ends, I will carry this experience with me. I will remember that humanity is not tied to nationality or politics or ideology. I will remember that it is possible to be enemies and still treat each other with respect. I will remember that a nurse is a nurse, a doctor is a doctor, and that healing is a universal language. The letter passed through censorship. It reached her mother in a Japan that was, by that time, staring at the reality of defeat. Part 5. The Reckoning Scene. 17. August, 1945. The announcement came without warning. Japanese radio broadcasts spoke of a new weapon. A weapon so powerful that an entire city had been destroyed. Hiroshima. A name that meant nothing to most of the women in the camp, a place most of them had never been, but a place where thousands of people, civilians, children, the elderly, had been obliterated in an instant. The women listened to the broadcast through an interpreter, and the news struck them with the force of a physical blow. Whatever else they had come to understand about their American captors, this was unimaginable. The technology that could destroy an entire city existed. America had used it. Japan would soon surrender. For a few hours there was chaos in the barracks. Some women wept for the lives lost. Some raged at the betrayal of their government, which had not defended them or their country. Some simply sat in shock, trying to process a world that had fundamentally changed. Fumiko found herself in the hospital, not as a patient, but as an interpreter. Dr. Harrison had asked for her assistance in communicating with some of the women who were experiencing panic attacks and psychological distress in response to the news. She was sitting in an office with one of the nurses when an American soldier came in with the afternoon mail. Among the letters and packages was a newspaper, an American newspaper with photographs. The photographs were of Hiroshima. Dr. Harrison looked at the images, and Fumiko saw something cross his face. It was not satisfaction or pride. It was horror. It was regret. It was the acknowledgement of a terrible thing that had been done. He looked at Fumiko, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. No words seemed adequate. I'm sorry, he finally said. It was 2 words, but they carried weight. They carried the acknowledgement that something had happened that was, perhaps, beyond the moral framework they had both been operating within. I know, Fumiko replied in English. I know you are sorry. Scene 18. The surrender. 2 weeks later, Japan surrendered. The war was over. In the barracks, the women received the news in ways that ranged from relief to devastation. The war they had fought for, the sacrifice they had made, had ended in defeat. But they had survived. They were alive. And they would go home. The American commandant announced that the women would be processed for repatriation. They would be sent to a port facility, then transported back to Japan. The process would take weeks, perhaps months. As they prepared to leave Camp Polk, the women experienced something that surprised them all. They did not want to leave. Not because they preferred captivity, but because what they had experienced here, the order, the respect, the basic recognition of human dignity, had become something they valued. They were going back to a defeated Japan, a nation that had lost everything, a country that would be occupied and rebuilt. They did not know what waited for them there, but they knew what they had experienced here. Scene 19. The departure. On their last morning at Camp Polk, women lined up for final roll call. Guards stood at attention, their faces showing the same professional neutrality they had maintained throughout the captivity. But as the women were loaded onto the transport trucks that would take them to the port, something unexpected happened. Dr. Harrison appeared, along with several of the nurses who had treated women at the hospital. They stood by the trucks, and one by one, They handed out small packages and written notes to the women as they boarded. For Fumiko, the nurse, Nurse Margaret, pressed a small leather-bound journal into her hands. On the first page, written in careful English, was a message. Remember that you are worthy of care and respect. You deserve to heal and to be well. Take this journal home with you and write about what you have learned. The world needs to understand that war does not have to mean the end of humanity. Fumiko could not speak. She held the journal to her chest and looked at the nurse, and they embraced briefly, a violation of the rules that had governed the entire captivity, but allowed in this final moment because the moment was outside of normal time. Scene 20. The return home. The journey back to Japan took weeks. The women traveled by transport ship across the Pacific, and when they finally came within sight of the Japanese coast, there was a moment of collective silence in the hold where they were quartered. Japan. They were coming home, but to a country they did not recognize from the descriptions they were hearing. A Japan that had lost the war, that was being occupied by American forces, that was being reconstructed according to principles that many Japanese found foreign and threatening. When they landed and were processed through the repatriation facility, Fumiko saw her mother for the first time in 3 years. Her mother was smaller than Fumiko remembered, thinner, aged by years of rationing and worry. But when she saw Fumiko, she moved forward and they held each other without words. Later, in the small house that had miraculously survived the bombing and the war, Fumiko told her mother about Camp Polk. She told her about the hospital, about the nurses, about the doctors who had treated her infection with antibiotics, about the profound realization that mercy could exist even in war. Her mother listened, and as Fumiko spoke, her mother's rigid expression began to soften. Not because she agreed with everything Fumiko was saying, but because she understood that her daughter had been shown something important, that her daughter had survived not just the war, but the experience of having her fundamental understanding of the world shaken and reformed. Scene 21. Legacy. Decades later, Fumiko would become a nurse in post-war Japan. She would work at a hospital that was, in many ways, modeled on the American hospital she had visited as a prisoner. She would train young nurses in techniques of compassionate care, and she would tell them stories about what it meant to treat a patient as a human being worthy of dignity and respect, regardless of nationality or politics or circumstance. She kept Nurse Margaret's journal with her, and she wrote in it for 60 years, documenting her experiences, her recovery, her transformation from a frightened young woman raised in a military culture to a healer who understood that healing transcended borders. When she died, at the age of 87, the journal was found by her granddaughter. It was published in Japan as a memoir, and later translated into English. It became a testament not just to her individual experience, but to the possibility of human connection even in the midst of conflict. The book was called Are You Angels?, taken from the question she had asked the American nurse during her hospitalization. The title became a touchstone for discussions about the nature of healing, the possibility of mercy, and the recognition that the people we are taught to fear might, in fact, teach us the most important lessons about what it means to be human. Scene 22. The Epilogue. In 2010, at an international medical conference in San Francisco, an elderly Japanese woman sat on a panel discussing cross-cultural approaches to patient care. The woman was Fumiko, now retired but still engaged with the nursing profession. Also on the panel was a woman named Helen Martinez, now 93 years old, the same WAC volunteer who had processed the prisoners at Camp Polk 65 years earlier. They had not seen each other since the war. They did not know the other was still alive. When they recognized each other during the panel discussion, there was a moment of profound recognition. Helen stood up from her seat, and Fumiko stood up from hers, and they moved toward each other and embraced across the years and across all the distance that war and time and national borders had tried to create between them. The audience watched, understanding without being told the significance of what was happening. This was what the war had tried to prevent. This connection, this recognition of shared humanity, this embrace across the boundaries that warfare and propaganda tried to establish. When they sat back down, Helen took Fumiko's hand and squeezed it gently. "I never forgot you," Helen said. "I never forgot you either," Fumiko replied. You were the one who told me the rules. You explained how we would be treated. You gave me the information I needed to understand that captivity did not mean the end of humanity. Helen smiled. I was just doing my job, she said. Exactly, Fumiko replied. You were just doing your job with humanity and with respect. And that changed everything. The end reflections on the story. This script tells the true inspired story of a moment in history when the machinery of war encountered the human capacity for compassion. It is not a story without complications. The war was real, the damage was real, the suffering was real. But it is also a story about the recognition that even in war, even between enemies, even in situations where cruelty might be expected or even demanded by military logic, there existed people who chose a different path. The women who were prisoners at Camp Polk and other American POW camps experienced treatment that was, in many cases, far superior to what they had experienced in their own military structures. They experienced the application of military rules and the Geneva Convention not as minimum standards to be resented, but as a genuine commitment to treating prisoners with basic human dignity. And in experiencing that dignity, they learned something that propaganda and distance and the machinery of war had prevented them from learning. That Americans were not beasts or monsters or enemies devoid of humanity. They were people, many of them, who took seriously the commitment to treat others with respect even in the context of war. This story is told from the perspective of those who were transformed by that experience. It honors their journey from fear to understanding, to ultimately a new vision of what humanity could be. It suggests that while wars are fought with weapons, wars are ultimately won or lost through the demonstration of values, and that the values demonstrated in how prisoners are treated, how the sick and wounded are cared for, how boundaries are respected even in situations where power could be exercised without consequence. These are the things that determine whether a civilization will endure and be remembered with respect. The script ends not with the end of captivity, but with a moment of reunion 65 years later, suggesting that the real victory in war is not territorial or political, but the creation of connections and understandings that transcend the original conflict and endure across time. That is the true power of this story, that it demonstrates the possibility of transformation, of understanding, of recognizing our common humanity even, or especially, in circumstances where hatred and cruelty might seem justified.